Let's talk about the Exorcist franchise, a series that started as one of the most terrifying and respected horror films ever made and then completely lost control of itself. Trust me, you're not going to believe how quickly this goes from serious, Oscar-winning horror to who approved this. What began as a grounded, deeply unsettling story about possession and faith somehow turned into a timeline full of disconnected sequels, two completely different prequels that contradict each other, and a modern reboot that acts like none of it even happened. Today we're breaking down exactly what happens in every Exorcist movie, from the iconic original to everything that came after. Let's start with the one that made all of this possible, The Exorcist, 1973. The movie opens in Iraq, where Father Merrin is part of an archaeological dig. He uncovers a small artifact of the demon Pazuzu and then comes face to face with a massive statue of the same entity. No explanation, no over-the-top horror. It's quiet, uneasy, and immediately tells you something is very wrong. Then we shift to Georgetown, where we meet Chris MacNeil and her daughter Regan, living a normal, comfortable life. That normalcy is what makes everything that follows hit so much harder. This is a slow burn in the truest sense. Nothing feels rushed. At the same time, we meet Father Karras, a priest and psychiatrist dealing with a crisis of faith and the declining health of his mother. This is where the movie separates itself from typical horror. It's not just about possession, it's about belief, doubt, guilt, and vulnerability. Then Regan starts to change. It begins subtly with strange behavior, mood swings, and an imaginary friend. Chris doesn't immediately jump to supernatural explanations. She turns to doctors and specialists. The film leans heavily into medical explanations first, and some of those scenes are just as uncomfortable as anything involving the demon. It feels invasive and real. Eventually, the movie removes all doubt. Regan's condition becomes undeniably violent and unnatural. Burke Dennings is found dead after being left alone with her, his neck twisted in a way that shouldn't be possible. Regan is speaking in multiple voices, displaying knowledge she shouldn't have and showing physical strength that makes no sense. This isn't psychological anymore. Chris turns to Father Karras. Their dynamic is one of the strongest parts of the film, an atheist mother and a priest who's losing his faith, both trying to make sense of something that clearly doesn't make sense. It's grounded, emotional, and completely believable. Karras investigates, but the deeper he goes, the more everything falls apart. Then comes the turning point. The words "help me" appear on Regan's body, so the church approves an exorcism, but only under one condition: an experienced priest must lead it. Enter Father Merrin. Once he arrives, everything locks in. The exorcism itself is iconic for a reason. The lighting is cold and harsh, the room feels claustrophobic, and Regan's appearance, thanks to groundbreaking makeup, still holds up. The pale skin, the wounds, the head rotation, it's all practical and deeply unsettling. Then there's the sound design. Regan's voice, created by Mercedes McCambridge, sounds genuinely inhuman. The mix of growls, layered voices, and unnatural tones makes it feel like something that shouldn't exist. Add in the score, especially tubular bells, and the entire film carries this constant sense of dread. What really makes it work is that the demon isn't just attacking physically, it's psychological. It taunts the priests and targets Karras' guilt and loss of faith. It knows exactly how to break him. Behind the scenes, the making of this movie adds to its legacy. The set famously caught fire, delaying production, except for Regan's bedroom, which was left untouched. Multiple cast and crew members experienced injuries, and several people connected to the film died during and after production. Whether you believe in the so-called curse or not, it only adds to the film's reputation. But ultimately, it's the ending that defines everything. Merrin dies during the exorcism, and Karras is left alone. The demon shifts tactics, appearing as his mother. In one final act, Karras does the only thing he can. He demands the demon leave Regan and take him instead. It works. The demon enters Karras, and before it can do any harm, he throws himself out the window, sacrificing his life to save hers. It's not just a shocking ending, it's a meaningful one. Karras, who spent the entire movie struggling with his faith, finds it again in the moment it matters most. Regan survives with no memory of what happened. Life moves on, but the impact doesn't. That's exactly why this movie still holds up. It's not just scary, It's controlled, deliberate, and grounded in a way most horror films never are. Every element, the acting, the lighting, the makeup, the sound, works together to create something that feels real. And if you think what comes next builds on this, you're going to be very surprised. Exorcist II, The Heretic, 1977. The film opens with Father Lamont attempting an exorcism in Latin America, and it goes very wrong. There's fire, chaos, and a complete lack of control. It's not tense or methodical like the first film, it's loud and disjointed. Right away, the tone feels off. Lamont is then assigned by the church to investigate Father Merrin's death and determine whether his actions during Reagan's exorcism were heretical. On paper, it's a strong premise. The idea that the church might question the legitimacy of what happened in the first film is interesting. But instead of grounding that idea, the movie immediately veers in a different direction. We reconnect with Reagan, now older and living in New York, seemingly recovered but still under psychiatric care. This is where the movie introduces one of its biggest swings, a device that allows people to synchronize their brainwaves and share memories. It's essentially a dream-linking machine, and it pushes the story into science fiction territory. It's not a terrible concept, it's just out of place. The first film built its horror on realism and uncertainty. This one replaces that with abstract ideas and technology that feel disconnected from the original tone. Lamont uses the device to connect with Reagan, which leads to a series of visions involving Father Merrin's past. Through these sequences, we learn about a boy named Kokumo who was previously possessed by Pazuzu and somehow developed the ability to resist it. The film expands the mythology by suggesting that the demon targets individuals with special psychic abilities, positioning Reagan as part of something larger. It's a solid concept, but the execution is messy. The story jumps between locations, timelines, and concepts without fully committing to one. We move from New York to Georgetown to Africa, from reality to dream states, and it becomes difficult to stay grounded in what's happening. At one point, Reagan demonstrates psychic healing abilities by helping an autistic girl speak. It's a moment that should feel significant, but the film treats it as just another plot point before moving on. That lack of focus is what holds everything back. Meanwhile, Lamont continues his investigation, eventually traveling to Africa to find Kokumo, who is now studying locusts. The connection between Pazuzu and locust swarms becomes central to the story, adding another layer to an already crowded narrative. By the time we reach the final act, the film has fully abandoned the grounded horror of the original. Lamont and Reagan return to the Georgetown house, but instead of a contained claustrophobic setting, the movie escalates into spectacle. There are visions, doppelgangers, telepathic encounters, and a swarm of locusts overtaking the house as it begins to collapse. Lamont ultimately defeats the demon not through ritual or faith, but through physical confrontation with a doppelganger of Reagan, while Reagan uses a ritual tied to the locust mythology to banish Pazuzu. And just like that, it ends. The film is ambitious. It takes risks and tries to expand the story in new directions. There are ideas that could have worked with a more focused approach, but as a follow-up to the original, it struggles. The tone is inconsistent. The narrative is scattered, and the shift into science fiction removes the grounded fear that made the first film so effective. It's not a safe sequel, but it's not a successful one either. And somehow, this still isn't the strangest direction the franchise takes. The Exorcist III, 1990, set 15 years after Reagan's exorcism, the story shifts focus away from her entirely and follows Lieutenant Kinderman, who is now investigating a series of brutal murders in Georgetown. Right away, it feels more grounded. The tone is closer to a psychological thriller than supernatural horror, which honestly works in its favor. The murders are disturbing and oddly ritualistic. Victims are decapitated, bodies are desecrated, and the details don't add up. Even stranger, the evidence suggests multiple killers, but the patterns match the methods of the Gemini killer, a serial killer who was executed years earlier. So now we've got a dead killer somehow continuing his work. This is where the movie gets interesting. Kinderman's investigation leads him to a psychiatric hospital where he discovers a patient who was found wandering 15 years ago with no memory of who he was. The patient looks exactly like Father Karras, who, as we know, died at the end of the first film. except he's not acting like Karras. In some scenes, he appears as the Gemini killer himself, taunting Kinderman, confessing to the murders, and explaining exactly how it's all happening. The idea is that the killer's spirit has been placed inside Karras's body, with Karras trapped inside, forced to watch everything. Unlike the previous sequel, this concept works. A big reason for that is the dialogue. A lot of this movie is just conversations, long, quiet exchanges between Kinderman and this patient, and they're some of the most engaging parts of the film. The Gemini killer is calm, theatrical, and deeply unsettling, and those scenes carry most of the tension. There's also an unexpected amount of humor early on. Kinderman and Father Dyer have a natural, sarcastic back and forth that gives the characters real personality. It makes their friendship feel genuine, which is important, because when things start to go wrong, it hits. And things do go wrong. Dyer is murdered in the hospital in one of the film's more disturbing sequences, and from that point on, the tone shifts. The humor fades, the investigation gets darker, and the supernatural elements become harder to ignore. This all builds to one of the film's most famous moments, a long, static shot in a hospital hallway that suddenly explodes into one of the most effective jump scares in horror. No music, no warning, just pure timing. It's simple, but it works incredibly well. Eventually, everything leads back to Karras. The film reveals that the Gemini killer isn't acting alone. He's being guided by a larger force, implied to be Pazuzu, continuing the thread from the original film. Karras is still in there somewhere, trapped and suffering. The final act brings in an exorcism, somewhat abruptly thanks to studio reshoots, but it still delivers a strong emotional payoff. In a moment of clarity, Karras regains control and begs Kinderman to kill him. This time, he does. It's a darker ending, but it works. There's no grand victory, just a final act of mercy to end the cycle. The movie isn't perfect. The pacing is uneven, and the ending feels slightly forced, but compared to the previous film, it's a massive improvement. It's more focused, more character-driven, and far more effective in building tension. It doesn't try to replicate the original. It finds its own lane. But trust me, you're going to want to see what this franchise does next. Exorcist: The Beginning, 2004. After finally finding some footing again, the franchise decides to go backwards, and this is where we really start to lose the plot. This movie is an origin story for Father Merrin, showing how he lost his faith and became the priest we saw in the original. On paper, it's a great idea. Merrin is one of the most compelling characters in the entire franchise, but instead of focusing on that, the movie gets distracted immediately. It opens strong, with Merrin haunted by a traumatic World War II experience where he was forced to choose who lived and who died under Nazi control. It's dark and feels like it belongs in this universe, but once the story moves to Africa, things start to unravel. Merrin is brought to an archaeological dig where a buried church has been discovered, one that shouldn't exist in that place or time. It's a great setup and classic Exorcist material. For a little while, it works. There's mystery, tension, and the idea that the church was built to trap something underneath is genuinely compelling. But then the movie makes a choice. Instead of leaning into psychological horror, it goes all in on spectacle. Everything is bigger, louder, and much more graphic. There are hyena attacks, maggot-covered infants, violent seizures, bodies being torn apart. It's constant escalation. At a certain point, it stops being unsettling and just becomes exhausting. More gore doesn't equal more fear. The original film worked because it was restrained. It built tension slowly and made every disturbing moment count. This movie throws everything at you all at once, hoping something sticks. There are still interesting ideas. The discovery of a pagan temple beneath the church, the suggestion that this is the origin point of evil, the idea that the church was built to trap it, all of that is solid. But the movie never slows down long enough to explore any of it. Instead, it piles on more chaos. Possessed villagers, disappearing workers, British soldiers turning on each other. It becomes a mess of ideas without a clear focus. Eventually, it's revealed that Sarah, the doctor, is the one who's possessed, and Merrin is forced to do an exorcism beneath the church. This should be the climax of the film, but it doesn't land. It feels rushed, and by this point, the movie has relied so heavily on visuals that the emotional weight just isn't there. Then, it just ends. Maren survives, the church is buried again, and everything resets. Now, to give credit where it's due, Stellan Skarsgård is solid as Maren. He brings a sense of seriousness to the role that helps ground some of the film. There are moments where you can see what this movie could have been, but overall, it feels like a missed opportunity, and when you think the franchise couldn't get more confusing, it does something even stranger next. Dominion, prequel to The Exorcist, 2005. Remember everything that just happened in Exorcist, the beginning? Dominion is basically the other version of that movie. And no, that's not a joke. This is where the franchise fully breaks its own reality. Instead of moving forward, it says, what if we just redo the same prequel but differently? Same Maren, same African dig site, same buried church trapping evil, but now it's a different story. Different tone, different possession, different everything. Why is this happening? This version leans harder into the psychological and spiritual side of things. Maren is still dealing with trauma from World War II, still questioning his faith, but here the movie focuses on that internal struggle instead of drowning it in chaos. The setup is nearly identical. Maren arrives at the dig site, discovers the perfectly preserved church, and realizes something evil is buried beneath it. Instead of constant shock value, this version slows everything down. It's quieter, more serious, and kind of heavy. There's still violence, but it's more restrained. Instead of non-stop spectacle, the horror comes from how the evil spreads through people. Soldiers turn on villagers, villagers turn on each other. It's less about jump scares and more about corruption, which, to be fair, is closer to what this franchise should be doing. The possession this time centers on a young boy named Cheche, and instead of immediately going into full chaos mode, the movie builds to it. There's a slow realization that something isn't right, that what looks like a miracle might be something darker. And that's where this version has some strong ideas. The demon doesn't just attack physically, it tries to break Maren psychologically. It tempts him with the chance to undo his past, to fix the moment that destroyed his faith. It's a compelling concept, and it ties directly into his character in a way the previous version barely touched. But here's the problem. Even though this version is more thoughtful, more restrained, and arguably more in line with the original film's tone, it still exists next to another movie that tells the same story completely differently. So instead of feeling like a meaningful prequel, it just raises more questions. Which version is canon? Which one actually happened? Why did we need both? And the movie never answers that because it can't. This version has a stronger focus, better themes, and a clearer understanding of what makes this story interesting. But it also feels slower, less dramatic, and at times, almost too subdued. So now we have two prequels, one that's loud, messy, and over the top, and one that's quiet, serious, and still somehow confusing. And just when you think it's over, they bring it back again. The Exorcist, Believer, 2023. The film opens in Haiti, where Victor and his pregnant wife are caught in a devastating earthquake. He's forced to make an impossible choice, save his wife or his unborn child. It's a strong emotional setup and one of the better openings in the franchise. It's tragic and feels like it's building towards something meaningful. Fast forward 13 years, and Victor is raising his daughter Angela alone, having completely lost his faith. Angela and her friend decide to go into the woods and mess with a seance. Because of course they do, the girls disappear for 3 days, and when they come back, they're off. This is where the movie almost works. The early possession scenes are unsettling. There's a quiet, creeping dread that feels closer to the original. The girls act just normal enough to make it uncomfortable, and the film takes its time letting things unravel. For a moment, it feels like this might understand what made the first movie effective. But then it starts piling on everything. Instead of focusing on Victor and Angela, the movie brings in multiple families, multiple belief systems, multiple exorcists. It turns into what can only be described as the Avengers of exorcism. You've got a Catholic priest, a Baptist pastor, a Pentecostal preacher, a root work healer. Everyone's here. And the more people you add, the less focused the story becomes. The idea of combining different spiritual approaches is interesting. It's something new for the franchise. But the movie doesn't take the time to develop any of it. It just throws everyone into the same room and hopes it feels important. Then there's the return of Chris McNeil from the original film, which should be a huge moment. Instead, she attempts to help one of the girls and is immediately attacked. Catherine stabs her in the eyes with a crucifix, permanently blinding her and removing her from the story almost entirely. It feels less like a meaningful return and more like a checklist item. By the time we reach the final exorcism, the movie has completely lost its edge. The tension is gone, replaced by spectacle and noise. The group gathers to confront the demon, and it forces the parents into a choice. Pick which girl lives and which one dies. Victor refuses to choose, but Catherine's father panics and chooses to save his own daughter. Here's the twist. The demon kills the one who is chosen. Catherine is dragged to hell while Angela survives. It's a solid idea, but it doesn't hit as hard as it should because we haven't spent enough time with these characters to feel the weight of that decision. In the end, Angela survives and returns to normal, Victor regains his faith, and the story wraps up cleanly. There are good performances here, and the opening act shows real potential, but the film tries to do too much without fully committing to anything. It's not terrible, but for a franchise revival, it feels surprisingly safe. After everything this series has done, that might be the most disappointing part. And that's the Exorcist franchise, a series that started as one of the most terrifying films ever made, and somehow turned into a timeline full of wild swings, confusing choices, and multiple attempts to figure out what it even wants to be. From groundbreaking horror to dueling prequels and a modern reboot that tries to pull it all back together. It's been a ride. If you made it this far, I need to know. What franchise should I break down next? Drop your pick in the comments. And if you enjoyed this video, make sure to like, subscribe, and hit the bell so you don't miss what's coming next on Shriek Geek. Catch you in the next one.